So while working on the Cartoon Brew joint, I actually had to think about the ramifications of that MLP article from a while back. It's such a fascinating thing that I wasn't around for. Seeing how Mid is being cited in books now for his terrible takes, I can't imagine this would be far behind from being immortalized in literature. Obviously, we've been looking at this dude and expecting terrible takes for a while now, but I did want to analyze this one and see if he's onto something. In a technical sense, you could perhaps make a legitimate argument, but despite this being an issue that could easily be strung into a fair narrative, of course, the way Amid went about it had invalidated the topic completely. See, the gist of the post was supposed to tackle a shift towards more toyetic properties and the lack of creative balance between them. What it did, however, was hyperinflate the situation to reflect the worst timeline, which was not accurate to what was going on. Adventure Time was among the few shows that he cited as a holdout as far as creator-driven content goes. Part of the reason why this take was so bad is because they seem to miss the point of TV animation's subsections. Very rarely is a production a black and white process. There's plenty of room for creative influence, even on toyetic projects. Friendship is Magic would not only prove itself to be a sporting merchandising machine, but also a well-crafted creative pursuit. Over the course of a decade, the various teams were able to give us a far deeper pool of masterful world building with its polished characters, fantastic art direction, spell-binding music, and of course, the power of friendship. They kept the gravy train going for 10 years without really sacrificing the integrity of the show. And sure, there were rockier points, but generally, the writers had carte blanche to maintain their blueprint until the bitter end. It's not only considered part of the vast expanse that many would deem to be the silver age of TV animation, but to me, it's the pillar that ultimately solidified not the death, but the rebirth of creator-driven cartoons. Animation has always been used to adapting to new circumstances, which has led to innovations in the field. And when the field was pioneered, these terms didn't really exist. The only differentiation you could make was between cartoons and animation. Sometimes you could tell the difference, sometimes not. The first TV cartoon, Crusader Rabbit, came onto the scene in 1950, and despite it having a consistent character at the helm, it would probably be best described as a premise-driven series with majority creator influence. When it was initially aired, each story arc was split up into 4-minute segments for broadcast and strung together. Each would tell one consistent story. Over time, when animation built up more of a presence in entertainment, it started to become more sought after as a vehicle to sell things to that newly prized children's demographic. So by the 60s, advertising and kids shows had long since popped off. Yesterday it had sponsored television, and the next day the sponsors became the television. Many typically cite Linus the Lionhearted as an example of capital commercialized chaos. The eponymous post-serial mascot and his friends would perform for half an hour while hawking their various wares. I like to think of it as the catalyst for an explosion of story-driven cereal commercials, but don't quote me on that, that's not really my department. From the late 60s to the mid-80s, numerous regulatory bodies made it much harder for merchandise-driven cartoons to thrive, as they did just a short time before. That doesn't mean creator-driven properties were running rampant throughout the television space, it just meant that we got more wholesome alternatives. Enter properties like Care Bears, Little Clowns of Happy Town, and the Get Along Gang. They weren't exactly creator-driven in spirit. In fact, many of them had healthy shelf lives in terms of merchandise. The main difference was that love and friendship was being marketed instead of violence and presumed immorality. Deregulation happened by the time Reagan came onto the scene, and the violent action-packed cartoons of yore came back around for another run. But by the 90s, the creator-driven revolution had begun and gave us a full onslaught of new, exciting, creator-driven concepts that had as much soul as silliness. Throughout the 2000s, newer technologies and innovations made for an interesting time, but the revolution soldiered on and gave us great stories no matter the network. We saw more wider franchises get facelifts and new transformations. They had the soul of the fully original IPs, but of course, utilized wider stories and worlds from decades prior. Finally, the kids that grew up with the beginning of the revolution, paved the way for one of their own with the current age of TV animation, one that continues to shine today. I don't think the concept of creator-driven content is thought of much nowadays. I feel that many believe it to be innate at this point. The rise of the internet and streaming apps espouse this idea that rampant creative freedom is just beyond door number 2. But as we've come to learn, even the best options have limitations to them. Generally, considering everything to keep in mind, I'd say most cartoons we see are more creator-driven than not. Some are products of a wider product, but even so, creators are given more liberties to transform even the most corporate of concepts than ever before. Generally, even fans of franchises are given the power to terraform an IP they love, but basically anyone with the creative chops can transform anything from a book adaptation to a 50-year-old franchise, and we're all the better as an audience for it. Besides, how else could we have had Battletoads in such a pristine condition?